Welcome back again to my Angular 7 course. Today we're going to talk about emitting events and the event emitter class that we use. So let's get started. So if you notice my page right now, what I have is a component that will emit an event. And when I talk about an event, it could be some type of value change or an object change or something that I just want to make the parent or my parent aware that something has changed inside my component. Now, we treat the event emitter component as any type of component. Uh, it is a component itself, except it's going to have two additional, or well, in this particular case, you can have as many as you want. I'm going to show you an example of just a value change, and then I'm going to show you an example of an object change. So if you have a particular object that changes, then we can also pass this back to the parent, and the parent can decide what to do once the object changes. The imports that we're going to use are the usual component, the onInit, which I just do it by as a habit. Then we're going to have a new one called event emitter, which is needed for us to use the event emitter class, and then the output interface for the decoration part, the annotation of our events. These all come from Angular Core. We don't need an observable class because we're not doing anything with observables currently, so I'm just importing it because force of habit. We don't need the service class, so you can ignore that, but we do need a model class. So what I've done is I've created a sample model in my sample object file, TypeScript file. So if we take a look at that, it's just a sample model which has a name, a phone, and an email property. That's all it has. Now, the component itself is just like any other component, as I mentioned before. It's going to have a selector. So we're going to call this particular component event emit. And we're going to also have an HTML view attached to this. So the HTML view is going to have two things. It's going to have a text box, and we're going to do property bind, two-way bind on the text box using ng model so that I can access this particular property on my component. And then we're also going to have a button which has an event bind to a click event, where if they click the button, it will call this value changed function. We'll go into that in a little bit. Our event emit component will also contain two output properties. The first one is called the value change, and then the other one is called the obj change. So this you can define as anything you want. You can name it whatever you want. We're going to instantiate that as a type of an event emitter without any type of object related to it. And then the object change, we're going to use the template sample model as a template using, again, the event emitter. So this is the gravy of this whole lesson. By doing this, we are telling the parent who uses us that we have two events that you can catch: the value change event and then the object change event. These properties are just properties of my component. So we're going to have a counter, an email address, which is what we were binding at using ng model here. And then we're going to have a sample model, which we're going to use to emit the change back to the parent. So we're going to do that as well. Don't pay attention to my constructor. There's nothing really we're going to do with a constructor. I just created an injection of a service, but that's not important. On init, I'm going to take my interface object, sample obj, and I'm just going to set the value to steven.mike@gmail.com. So I'm just initializing this particular property for this model interface. Now we also have a value changed function, which is called when I click on the button. And that's actually going to do a couple of things. One, it's going to change the value of my counter property in my component every time I click. And then it's also going to change the value of the sample object property email to whatever is in the text box. If we look, whatever they type in on this text box, we will set that to our sample object that we have currently in our event emitter. The next thing is something. This is where you're making your money. Is you want to alert whoever is using your component, this event emit component, that things have changed. In this case, I'm using the output decorator, this value change, right? The output, and I'm using the emit function. And what this does is it actually sends a trigger to the parent, who's ever calling this event, that says, hey, there's been a change, and this particular event has a variable that you can catch. And the change that happened is based off this variable called counter, which is my variable, right? It's my variable called counter in my property. And at the same time, I'm also going to emit another event change where I'm telling the parent, hey, the object also changed, and I'm going to send this back to you. I'm going to send this object back to you with the change, which I did because we're changing it every time we click on this button, right? Obviously, if we go, let's look at how this would look. So right now, don't look at the bottom because this is a parent component and our event component is embedded. So if we actually take a look, anything above the HR line is going to be our event emitter component, and anything below is going to be the parent, right? And then I'll show you how this looks. So what you have now is if I type something in and I click on this button called click me, this represents what I'm doing here in terms of the front end. Now, where is this other stuff coming from? Well, that's why I told you. So in order for this event emitter to synchronize and work, this event emitter is your child component, which is called or used by somebody that's going to catch the event. And that person is, which we built out here, is called the event catcher. So we created our own event catch. We have the event emit child component that we're using, which is the one that I just showed you now. And in this particular HTML, we're handling the value changed event, right? And the object change event. So where do these come from? Well, remember, we're at the catch event. So this is a parent. We're catching these two, right? But you got to remember that these two are coming from what I labeled them with using my output decorators, right? So this is the value change, and then this is the object change. So I'm using the value change and then the object change. So I'm catching these events, and now in my parent, I am going to define a function once this triggers. So it's kind of like a two-step process, right? You catch the event, so you must know what the output decorator labels are, right? In this particular case, they're value change, object change. So we got to go back to the child, which is the event emit, which is a component we created, and catch these, right? And then we got to create functions in the parent to define this particular catch. So in the parent, we have a function that I've defined called display counter and update object. So if we go back here, we have this is the parent now. This is the display counter and update object. Whenever I click on the button, right, that's going to trigger the event, right? That's going to trigger the event. So that's going to go here into my value change, and I'm going to trigger the event that the counter changed and then the object changed. If we look at my parent, which is the catcher, I'm going to take the count, right? Because we use this $event as the event that's actually being triggered, which in our case is a variable, right? And we catch this as a parameter here. We're going to console.log, and then we're going to change our property variables to the value that's coming back. In this particular case, I'm getting back a count, and I am setting it to emitted counter. If we look at the catch, again, this is the property binding. It's going to now trigger up here, and I'm going to get back that particular value. And then the object being emitted, because that's going to emit as well, so it's going to call both functions. The email has changed because I'm going to type in a different email every time, and that will be set as my own private, it's not really private, but my own object that I've created of sample model interface type. And then this is my object that I'm going to be using in my view. Okay, in my view. So I got it back. I make a copy of it, right? And I set it to the property, okay, of my sample object here. And now I have the value that's changed. So let's give it a shot. So if I come here, oops, sorry. We're just gonna refresh this. So I'm gonna say that Rocco Louis at gmail.com. Now, remember, this is all happening, anything above the HR line is all happening in the child component. When I mean by child, we can represent that as our event emit component, which comes with its view, right? And we looked at that, the text box and the button. Now, we're going to emit this change. And notice how the parent now caught the updated counter value, which we incremented, and it also caught the email that was changed because I passed in the whole object, so I know that the email is going to change. And now we can communicate between parent and child events. You can now the parent can communicate and see what is actually going on in this particular child event. And that's actually a great thing, because as you separate your code into different components, if one particular component is changing a value, you may want to alert the parents to say, hey, my value has changed. I'm the child of, event catcher. And then the event catcher, using the functions provided, right? You build your own function, catch that event, and then do whatever you need to do. In this particular case, we're catching it. We're using a new variable and assigning it to our new component objects and variables. And then we're just going to bind it using the property binding. uh, over here. Okay. So this is how you emit events. This is how you emit events. So I'm gonna post this code again on my GitHub. You can bring it down, and hopefully it's not too confusing. I think once you look at the code and you focus on these four things, I think everything should be gravy. Again, this is Alex Louis, part-time adjunct. If you enjoyed the video, give me a like. If you didn't, don't give me a dislike. Send me a comment. Tell me why it sucked. Thanks, and I'll see you soon.